administration, people, finance all come together to actually address these problems. So really that's all I wanted to say, just to introduce Gavin and to thank him very much today for coming along to talk us. Gavin, over to you.
Thank you. You're very welcome. Thank you, Robin. Thank you, Anne, for the invitation to speak. Thank you all for coming in person. Nice to see you in real life. And hello online. I've realised I've already got the date wrong on my slide. Hopefully that's the only mistake I've made, but there we go. I'm here, and you're all here, so there's something right going on. I'm going to talk about this report, and a little bit about why write a report at all. Briefly talk about the team and how we did what we did. Spend most of the time talking about what we've found, if you like, and the policy recommendations. And in the time since I was invited to give this talk, the government has at long last published its heat and building strategy, which is a 200-page document, which I have now read. So if there's time at the end, I'll do a quick overview and a critique of the heat and building strategy as well. And hopefully we can then have a good old discussion, because I'm sure there's lots of people with views and ideas, not just mine. Okay, so why talk about retrofit and why this report now? Housing, there's 29 million homes in the UK. Housing is a significant chunk of energy demand and CO2 emissions, and we can reduce that by doing up homes. But it's not just an energy and climate issue. We can improve the health and well-being of residents. There is quite a strong argument in favour of good quality green jobs that can be associated with doing this kind of work. And because domestic energy demand correlates a lot with peak demand, then actually if we can reduce the demand of homes, then we can actually do something for the energy system in terms of managing the peak, especially if we go all out for electrifying heat through heat pumps and other technologies. I'm not going to talk about the system side much, but there are various benefits of doing this work. More prosaically, there is an organisation called the Construction Leadership Council, which is an alliance of trade associations in the construction industry. And they, in the summer of 2020, or actually before that, they were invited by the government to come up with plans for an economic recovery post-pandemic. And so they were keen to put forward some of these ideas and arguments. And actually, for the first time, the Construction Leadership Council took account not just of new building, but of renovation. And they took account of housing, not just commercial buildings. So that was quite interesting. The Federation of Master Builders is part of the Construction Leadership Council, and they want to build on the high-profile work that's been done through that to raise their own profile and to raise the profile of the construction sector as potential agents of climate mitigation. And then I work with this organisation, CREDS, the Centre for Research and Energy Demand Solutions, and CREDS is keen to work with business and policy and industry to create more impact from research. So it's a very good relationship that we've had with them. Briefly, the CREDS team. I was asked by the Chief Executive of the Federation of Master Builders to do this thing, and I had a quick think about it and picked what, in my terms, are the dream team. So you've got Aileen Eales, who's a knowledge exchange manager within CREDS, and the other 6 people you see on the screen there have all got research and practical experience of doing renovation on housing. There's at least a lifetime's worth of research experience in that team. I'm not going to read out all the names, but I will just mention Chris Joffé, because he's got an acronym, and that's the Welsh Government's Independent Implementation Group on Residential Decarbonisation, which could be snappier, but that's what they call themselves. And the aim of CREDS, broad, very high level, is to work with researchers, businesses and policymakers in support of a transition to net zero. Okay. I'm not going to labour this either. You can look at the slide later if you wish, but CREDS is a consortium of more than a dozen universities. I think this is slightly out of date now, and a couple of others have since joined, but it's one of these big research consortia funded by UK research and innovation, particular focus on energy demand. All right, in good academic tradition, let's start off with the definition. people talk about retrofit and often mean something slightly different from each other, and you end up with these conversations that don't quite gel. So here we're defining retrofit as a process of making change to buildings and technical systems in buildings so that energy consumption and the associated CO2 emissions are reduced in line with energy and climate policy goals. It's a bit long, but all of those elements are important. Notice we're not defining a technical standard. We're not saying it's zero at the level of an individual building. We're not saying it's a 50% reduction. We're not saying the metric has got to be energy. We're not saying the metric has got to be CO2. There's so much else going on, and the problem is so broadly systemic that we're just saying in line with climate and energy policy goals. We can talk about deep retrofit, shallow retrofit, integrated retrofit, but broadly speaking, this is the definition we're using. We've got 29 million homes. It's about 30% of energy demand. It's about 17% of UK emissions. If you add in the commercial sector of buildings, it's about 30% of total emissions, but we're just talking about housing now. And that little pie chart shows you that just under 2/3 of the housing stock is owner-occupied, so it's privately owned and the people who own it live there. A bit less than 20%, 17% is in the social housing sector, and just under 20% is privately rented. Privately rented is also the biggest growing sector. There's been a kind of transfer from owner-occupied to private rented in the last few years. The efficiency potential is big. I mean, we have an inefficient housing stock and it's possible to reduce emissions by quite a lot, whilst also doing other good things. We know that we've got to replace our fossil heating systems. Something like 90% of UK homes are fired directly by natural gas, which is a fossil fuel. Those systems are efficient and what have you, but they nonetheless emit CO2 directly. And I mean, you can argue about these numbers, but if you do it well, high quality, well integrated work can reduce the emissions by 50%, whilst at the same time increasing levels of comfort and well-being, the service that's there. And as I said before, there are implications here for peak demand. If we didn't do retrofit and we electrified every heating demand, our peak demand would go up by a huge amount, and that in itself would create another problem with the energy system. And you've got on the right there the multiple benefits. Comfort, more attractive to live in, improve the health and well-being of people, cut people's bills, and then also this idea of significant numbers of green jobs. So, it all sounds great, doesn't it? But it's not a happy policy domain. Let's be honest about this. The one on the left here was actually just earlier in 2020, I think it was. Look at my slide with my glasses on. No, this is 2021. So the government announced a scheme to give people cash to insulate their homes, the Green Homes Grant. They were told in advance of announcing this last autumn that it wouldn't work in the way they designed it. They went ahead anyway. It didn't work. After 6 months, it was quietly dropped. The one on the right goes back to about 2015. Some of you will remember the Green Deal, which was, trumpeted with great fanfare. Required quite a lot of legislative effort, a lot of political capital was invested in it, and basically that didn't work either. It was a very expensive loan with a high interest rate that treated the renovation of buildings as a kind of economic rational decision. People only do this to save money, and that there's plenty of evidence that says that's not the case. And the Green Deal basically didn't work, and again was quietly dropped. I mean, there's a kind of rump that's left, but it's not doing anything like what it was designed to do. So those are kind of, that's a message of caution, I suppose. If you look back historically, we've not been very good at doing this. Okay, so we wrote this report, and what we did, we didn't have much time. We had about 3 or 4 months. Fortunately, we've been working away, like I say, for a collective lifetime anyway. So we've got a good idea of the existing literature. Lots of research has been done. And we facilitated a workshop with 21 members of the Federation of Master Builders, and we basically road tested some policy ideas with them to see what they thought. And these are under-researched people. The way that their working lives operate is often taken for granted in these debates, and yet the assumption is that they're the ones who are going to just get on and do it. And as you'll see, they have quite good reasons for not just getting on and doing it without enough support in place of the right kind. So the question we asked these people was, how can the existing market, which is for repairing, maintaining and improving buildings, how can it be transformed so that the opportunities for doing retrofit at the same time are integrated into the everyday practice and market activity of that entire industry? And the reason that you need that industry to do this is because of the scale. You've got 29 million homes and you've got 1.5 million construction workers. That's about the right scale to do it. If you just say that you're going to rely on new entrants to the industry or something else, then this industry will just continue in parallel and be much more dominant. So there's issues here about how you take an existing industry and transform it rather than pretending it doesn't exist. And there's a little bit of theory. I mean, it's a very applied version of the theory, but this phrase, market transformation, means something quite specific, and people use it in ways that sometimes it doesn't mean quite the same thing. The way we're using it here is, and this is based on decades of understanding, particularly with products. It's never really been tried with services, but we'll come to that. You have a policy toolkit. It has a huge history of success in appliance markets. If you go to a shop and buy a fridge or a washing machine these days, the one that you buy is a lot more energy efficient than the one you might have bought 20 years ago. And that's because of this policy toolkit. So you have minimum energy standards, which are announced to the industry ahead of time. You have information for consumers in the form of the well-known energy performance certificate, some kind of labelling scheme. That's the European one. There's different ones around the world. But you also provide some financial incentives to get the market going. Each one of those things does, it's the combination of those things that work. So if you just go for financial incentives, as we saw with the Green Deal, you don't really get there. It's introduced over time. There's a tension and a trade-off between pushing an industry to go further and faster, but not pushing it so far and so fast that it can't keep up and they basically walk away. So it's a negotiation between policymakers on the one hand and the delivery agents on the other. All goes on behind the scenes. It's not particularly prominent, but it happens. And it's also strongly based on good understanding of both the technical potential of these things, but also an understanding of the market that you're trying to transform. If you don't understand the market you're trying to transform, chances are you'll get it wrong. And again, going back to the policy failures, that's, I think, one of the reasons those things failed. And it's a long-term engagement. It's not something where you just announce it and expect it to happen overnight. You have to work out that this is going to take years, actually. 5-10 years and then ongoing as you ramp up your standards and improve things over time. It's an ongoing task to do this. Okay. The repair, maintenance and improvement market, which often gets abbreviated to RMI, for housing in this country, it's worth £29 billion a year, right? If you think there's 29 million homes, what that means is that on average, each home has about £1,000 spent on it per year. Now, some years people will spend nothing, and after 10 years you might suddenly spend 10, 15, 20,000 pounds. That money is being spent all the time, every day, as a matter of course, as part of repairing, maintaining and improving the built environment. I and one or two other people have tried to estimate what fraction of that is a good opportunity for retrofit, because not all of it is. If somebody says, my gutters are leaking, well, that's included in that £29 billion figure, but it's probably not a brilliant opportunity for insulating your roof. So you've got to be a bit careful about this. But maybe 40% of the total is some opportunity for doing retrofit, so 10, 11 billion pounds. So we talk about these as trigger points, because if you're investing in maintaining your building anyway, then actually some of the technical applications needed to reduce the energy demand and reduce the CO2 can be done at the same time. And you can, by doing it at the same time, you do two important things. You marginalise the cost, you make the total cost smaller than it might have been if you'd done them separately. And importantly for the householders, you make the disruption smaller. So the classic example is if somebody's having scaffolding put up to repair their roof, that's a great time to put the solar panels on the roof. You pay for the scaffolding once, you don't have the hassle of the builders in your, all outside your house twice, you just do it once. I talked a little bit about scale. This is another indication of scale. There's something like 45,000 building firms up and down the country, and they are predominantly small businesses, and actually they're predominantly micro businesses. So they're one-man vans, or they're enterprises with 1 to 3 employees by and large. And the other thing that we know from the research that's been done is that these people are actually very influential over consumer choice when it comes to repair, maintenance and improvement. And if you think about it, that makes sense. If you're having some work done in your home, you bring someone in and you want them to A, do a good job, and B, come back and fix it if it doesn't work out properly. If you flip that situation round for the builder, they want to be able to do something which they know pretty certainly is definitely going to work, and therefore they don't have to come back and fix. So there's a kind of built-in logic of being conservative with a small c in this industry, that they use tried and tested methods, they use tried and tested products because they know they're going to work and it's not going to cause them problems. Okay, but they're very influential. There's a boiler manufacturer that we did some research with, and they had some market data that said 60% of all boiler sales are entirely down to the recommendation of the installer. And for that reason, the boiler manufacturers have things like rewards points schemes with installers. So, like a nectar point scheme, to try and encourage those installers to recommend their product rather than a competitor's product. All right, let's talk a little bit about minimum standards. And because we're talking about a service market, I think it's important that we talk about two things. Energy standards, so an energy standard for the building, but also importantly, occupational standards. We need some kind of minimum requirement for the workforce that's doing this stuff, because it needs to be done well. The building regulations that we have in this country have not been tightened much in the last 10 years. So they used to be more so, but they've slightly dropped off the radar. They need to be tightened up regularly over time. It gives the industry a sense that the regulation is getting tighter and it's going to continue to get tighter, and so they look out for it. There is a system of checking compliance with building regulations, making sure that things have been done properly, but it's been undermined by government cuts. So something like there's been a 27% reduction in the number of building control inspectors in the last 10 years. And it needs to be systematic. It needs to be in pretty much on every project, and it needs to have good coverage. The building control inspectors therefore need resources for doing those compliance checks. But one of the things that comes out of the research, but also came out of the workshop with the FMB members, is actually they view these people not only as policing their work, but also a useful source of advice. So actually the advisory role of building control inspectors could be improved and built upon to actually help maintain that relationship and increase quality overall. Probably most controversial, or one of the more controversial things that came out of this discussion, is the need to have a license to trade, so that you can't be a director of a building firm. This is the proposal. Can't be a director of a building firm unless you've got a minimum qualification. There's plenty of occupations where that's already true. You can't go to the dentist and be treated by someone who's not done dentistry. Actually, you can't go and get your motor car serviced and have a certificate of fitness to be on the road, except by an accredited mechanic who's done qualifications and who every year has to top up their qualifications. So there's plenty of occupations and professions where this is already true, but in the building industry it's not. And that's a key reason why we keep having this kind of poor quality and lack of interest. And then you also have, in the construction industry, a kind of parallel economy that goes on. There's a lot of work that's done in sort of cash in hand. Anybody who's ever tried to get a builder to come and do things, you don't get a written quote, you'll get a discount if you do it cash in hand. And there's all sorts of sort of slightly strange tax dodging going on where people will do that kind of thing. It works. I mean, it's nice to have the cash incentive of not having to pay the tax, but actually what it does is it gives people an incentive to work outside of a regulated system. What we're saying here is that the system needs to have quality checks and therefore needs to be regulated. Therefore, we've got to find a way to squeeze out the people who want to work outside the regulated system. It's kind of a story of professionalisation, is what I'm talking about. Information on energy performance. This is one of the other elements of the market transformation model. We have energy performance certificates for buildings, but actually they're really not very accurate. They're based on a computer model which is used for evaluating the stocks of millions of properties, but they're really not accurate enough at the level of an individual building. So these should really, in future, be based on good quality building surveys. And those themselves would cost money to be done properly. But if we're going to use EPC ratings and use them as the form of new regulations, which is already talked about, you can't rent out your private property unless it's an E-rated property at the moment. If we're going to start looking at sales and rentals of property and applying the energy performance certificate to that, then those EPCs need to be much more robust. And at the moment, what we have is we don't have robust EPCs, and what we have, therefore, is a system where it's really easy to get out of doing anything. So that system for the private rented sector I mentioned, you have to have a minimum rating of E, but you can also self-certify to say that your building, you don't want to do it. And what's happened? Well, the landlords basically go on a website and click the box that says, my building's not appropriate. So nothing happens. There's this discussion about building logbooks and passports. So the idea that there's some kind of historical record of what's been done to a building, which then informs the next round of repair, maintenance and improvement, so that it helps the person who's coming second to understand what's been done first. It would also link to the energy performance certificate, and as the standards might improve over time or get tighter over time, you could then have a historical record of where your building has been and where it's going to. Yes, they would be nice. For me, the real weak link in this argument actually is having a database that's complete and accurate all the time. So this is putting the pressure back on the builders again to fill in the forms or go online and log the work that they've done. Could work, and actually the smart metering argument I think could help here. So if we had some way of automating the data collection, then that might be good, but it does need to be accurate. And then the final final leg of the three-legged stool of market transformation is the finance. This one is a bit more vague, I think, here, but the principles, I think, are reasonably well understood. We need sufficient upfront capital. It needs to be fair and affordable, not too aggressive. It needs to be fairly straightforward to get hold of. There are tales and case studies of policies which have failed because there's too much friction in the system of getting hold of the money. And it needs to be sufficient to pay for good quality retrofit. And here, what I'm saying is, people talk about heat pumps, for example, because it's the heating technology which is going to replace your boiler. But what about all the additional works that you need to do in order to make your heat pump actually fit in your home and work properly? Who's going to pay for those? Whether it's changing the pipes or changing some of the radiators or whatever it might be. It's not a drop-in replacement technology, that's the point. So something else is going to have to be done as well. There could be some combination of loans, grants and tax incentives that could help with this. We have seen in other countries, there's a picture there of the German KfW bank, where public finance has been used to help prime a lending market. It's fallen over, but it's going to come back. Oh, okay. Maybe the KfW are listening, who knows? Yeah, so some public investment can be used to prime the market, and then the private investment follows. But interestingly, when you talk with the investors and the banks, the people who are interested in this kind of stuff, they basically see this investment opportunity as a bit too risky. And the two things that they would like to de-risk it is a competent system for building certification, which takes us back to the EPC argument, and a competent system for installing accreditation, which takes us back to that army of 45,000 firms and the quality of the work that they do. And then at the bottom, added on, is a cut in VAT. It's an interesting one here, it's a bit of an odd one out. But one of the reasons why the cash in hand deals are done is because building work attracts a VAT rate of 20%. And so if you do it cash in hand and the person doesn't run that project through their accounts, you can get a discount of 20%. So if we reduce the VAT to maybe 5% or 0, the size of that incentive to do things outside the regulated market would be much smaller, or would disappear. That's the theory. It has been trialled and it has been shown to work. And curiously, the times that this has been trialled, the assumption is that if you reduce the rate of VAT, you will reduce the amount of tax that goes to the Treasury. What has been found with these schemes is that if you reduce the VAT in this market, because you bring so much of the work into the regulated economy, the actual take for the Treasury goes up. It seems completely counterintuitive, but it has been shown to work. It's a while ago now. I'm going back more than 10 years now, but it has been shown to work. Let's talk a little bit about skills. Because people talk about skills, and it is a big issue. It's actually one of the biggest issues, I think. But it's not just a question of setting up a few new courses, unfortunately. We've got new technologies that we need, and therefore there's a focus on the kind of technical skills. And some of those technical skills are very lacking, it's true. But retrofit is about more than just the technology. So we need skills on the technical aspects of retrofit, good business management skills, and also crucially better communication skills in this sector. Customer care, looking after people and explaining to them what's going on. Most of the qualifications in construction are sort of level 1, level 2 NVQ, which equates to sort of GCSE standard. Actually, I think those levels need to be higher. We need not just more training and different training, but a higher level. So you're talking about level 3 is equivalent to sort of A levels, and level 4 is equivalent to first year at university. So a technical training scheme that is actually equipping people with the knowledge and skills to do this stuff properly is quite a long way away from what we've got now. We've got some innovative new courses. I'm going to mention the PAS 2035-2030. It stands for Publicly Available Specification. There are some interesting things going on here. For example, PAS 2035 is for a new kind of role, an integrator, a retrofit coordinator, to lead and manage and coordinate all of the different aspects of doing this work properly. But it exists outside the mainstream further education system. So, that as a minimum needs to be integrated. It's one interesting new course. There are others. It by itself will not be sufficient. There's a whole lot of work to do here to build up the skills side of things. But fundamentally, even if you set up these courses, if you don't do anything to create a demand for those skills, then what will happen is the courses will fail to attract enough students. And the existing repair, maintenance and improvement work that happens at large volumes and relatively low quality, that will just carry on. So some kind of labour market regulation would allow you to drive the demand for skills. You're not allowed to run a firm unless you've got the qualifications. Someone wants to run a firm, therefore they have to go and do the course. And if you don't have the qualifications, then you can still get a job, but you can only work for someone else. You have to be an employee of someone else, which is actually very different from how it works at the moment, where there's lots and lots of one-man bands who are basically set up. You set up a business and you're a sole trader and you do what you like. If you can persuade enough people to employ you, and you can persuade a bank to lend you enough money to buy a van, you can do it. All of that is going to cost money. I mean, I haven't looked yet at how much money it might cost. At the moment, we have a system for funding training in this sector, which is extremely narrow. I think we need to have a proper discussion about how we support the placements on training courses and the support for apprenticeships. Apprenticeships is a really interesting model, but it's hard. It's really hard to get good quality apprenticeships going. It's a burden on the employer, and it's at the moment left down pretty much to the individual student and the individual business to decide if they want to do it. But we could have a system where we broker those relationships. So if you go to university, you have UCAS that brokers the whole system between universities needing students and students needing university places. We could have something similar here, but we don't have it yet. And then the other issue that's come out from research and from the workshop is this thing about local partnerships. So the reforms that are really needed here are really about new business models. We've got plenty of technology, and one of the key things to actually roll it out at any significant scale with sufficient quality is new business models. So we're talking about social and economic innovation that's not just about technology. We have seen examples of new business models which have centralised functions for admin, technical and marketing support for firms that provide some kind of customer care and guarantees to clients who step in if the work is not done well or if there are failures along the way. Sometimes actual firms themselves go bust halfway through a project. Who picks up the pieces then? And there's also some really interesting opportunities for closer working between the firms and the new business models, working with local authorities to do things on sort of neighbourhood and citywide scales. But resources are needed for that. It doesn't just happen on its own. Local authorities could, in theory, play a really interesting role looking at district scale energy systems where they tackle both the energy demand in their built environment and also look at local things like heat networks, which operate at a bigger scale than the individual building. Yeah, but all of that stuff happens at kind of at the scale of a local authority. It's not a national scale thing, that's too big. So that's a really interesting opportunity. The trouble is that we have in my view, because we have a very liberalised market for energy where people can change supplier at 28 days, that really doesn't help you build up the aggregated demand that allows you to invest in something as big as a heat network. So when you look at a country like Denmark, which has a lot of these things, what they actually have is municipal energy companies where people tie into that provider for 20, 30 years, and that allows them to provide that opportunity. So the governance arrangements are, I think, the key stumbling block for more heat networks. You know, this country has a few heat networks, but they're all going to stay small scale, I think, until we look at the governance arrangements better. Okay, I'm coming towards the end. This is a summary then of the policy recommendations in the report. Regular tightening of building regulations, invest in the local authority building control for compliance and advice, quite significant reforms of the energy performance certificates. The workforce also needs massive development. We need to introduce a licence to trade just to provide that basic step onto the ladder of qualification. And then there's a question of what people are being taught and how broad it is and what the standard is. So a broad course in training needs to be across the piece, and also then the levels need to be higher. Not for everyone, but the average needs to be higher. Let's cut VAT on RMI to 0 or 5% to squeeze out the unregulated market. We will have to have some kind of public investment to prime this, but there are private sector lenders willing to invest if it can only be de-risked for them. And we need some kind of way of providing access to capital. The pioneers of doing retrofit, I mean, as Robin said, I've done my home. It probably wouldn't count as good enough these days. We still have a gas boiler, for example. But when we did it, basically we provided the exception that proves the rule. It's such hard work. You have to be so determined to get any of this stuff going, and you have to have some money. All of those things have to come together. We know that most people in this situation are not going to have the cash just lying about or not be willing to invest their savings in it. So we need to have some affordable and fair access to capital for people. Of course, it's a research project, so we have to say more research needed. But seriously, the research that we're advocating is not so much technical field trials or demonstrators, but how can we find robust and repeatable solutions at scale? And some of this stuff is actually being done in Wales, and some of it is being done in Scotland, where you're looking at, we've got 29 million homes. Why don't we sacrifice 100 of them and bash them about and find out what can be done? Why don't we sacrifice 1,000 of them and bash them about and find out what can be done? I say sacrifice, actually, if we can do it well, you could use the funds from the sale of one property to support your next round of innovative coordinated field trials. And here I'm not talking just about testing technology, I'm specifically talking about testing the ability of the industry to provide robust enough, good quality enough solutions. So it's not a message of saying it's got to be zero, but where would you put that slider? And also, the builders themselves often have some really good ideas, and their voice is not being heard, and they're extremely practical. So they may be able to find ways of doing some version of value engineering here if we gave them their head and included them in the process. I think we can also talk about information management systems, whether it's smart metering or something else, possibly linked to renovation passports. Okay, I have now talked for just over half an hour, and I've got 3 slides on the heat and building strategy. Do you want them?
Please.
Right, okay. It's a 200-page document, and it's not an easy read. It's hard to figure out. Okay, I'll do this as quickly as I can. It was published just a couple of weeks ago. It has been eagerly awaited in the community of energy and buildings researchers and repeatedly delayed. Finally came out just before COP. No coincidence there. And it gives us necessary detail to add to the 10-point plan, which was very much a kind of a much shorter sort of bullet point approach. But the 10-point plan covers the whole economy. The heat and building strategy goes into much more detail about heat and buildings. All right. This is my personal overview and critique. I encourage you to go away and read it for the full detail. And I have necessarily selected things out of here that struck me as particularly worthy of talking about. And then I've turned it off. Right. Don't know what I did there, sorry. Okay. So there's a very strong focus on heat pumps, hydronic heat pumps that use water as a way of circulating the heat, not using air to circulate the heat into the home, but using existing wet systems. And they are proposing to place an obligation on the manufacturers of the heating appliances to build up the market for heat pumps. And the way they propose to do that is to place an obligation on the manufacturer to increase over time the percentage of heat pumps relative to the percentage of boilers that they sell. And it's not just the sales of the technology, but it's fixed to the installations of that technology. So it's not, you can't just sell it, someone's got to put it in. It's an interesting one. It probably won't work, but they're probably going to put a surcharge on the sale of boilers to pay for the financial support for the heat pumps. So you need to have a good enough supply of boiler sales to support the supply of heat pump sales. If you needed 10% of the stock to be heat pumps, that might work, but if you need 100% of them to be, or 80%, not so sure. Anyway, that's the step they've taken, and it is a first step. There's some support for hydrogen as an energy carrier in the heat and building strategy, and there's some support for heat networks. Just from the tone of the document, heat pumps is the main thing they're pushing, but they do talk about these other things. And there is a new future homes standard, which has been talked about before, but the theory is that from 2025, we will have a new standard for new homes, not retrofit, but we don't have any details yet. But just as an aside, we had a policy for net zero new homes in 2016, but we got rid of it. So let's just see how that goes. The retrofitted existing homes, I couldn't find any meaningful support for the owner-occupied sector beyond exhortation. They want people to install heat pumps, and they think that because people will want to do this stuff, that they will therefore invest in their property and maybe do some insulation at the same time. But no actual meaningful support. There are minimum standards for the private rented sector, which I talked about before, with all of its loopholes and exemptions. And there's a minimum standard for the social housing sector, but I couldn't find any extra funding to make that happen. And we know that local authorities are strapped for cash, so that doesn't particularly add up. There's a total programme of 450 million in heat pump grants, and that's £5,000 a time, or 6,000 if it's ground source. 450 million divided by 5,000 is 90,000. So they're providing some initial support for the first 90,000 heat pumps, but we're trying to talk about 20 million, 25, 29 million. So it's a very small drop in the ocean, or a very small first step. There's also some support under a thing called the Strategic Innovation Fund, and this is talking now about the electricity system, the impact of electrification of heat and transport on the electricity system itself. But this funding is only available to electricity companies, so it's a prod to innovate for those firms to come up with some magic way of either creating the infrastructure or doing away with the need for new infrastructure. I'm not sure which. And all of those 4 things are included system integration, data and digitalisation, heat and transport in the £450 million. Doesn't sound like a lot of money to me in relation to an electricity grid for a country the size of Britain, UK. Anyway, there's nearly £1.5 billion for public sector decarbonisation, which is non-residential buildings. And some of that has already happened, or it has been happening. So, that a similar fund paid for some of the heat network at the JR Hospital in Oxford, for example. I mean, these tend to be quite big and quite expensive schemes. So the 1.425 billion, it's welcome, but I doubt it will go far enough. There's a heat network transformation programme, £338 million. No details about that yet, and I couldn't find any mention of the governance arrangements that I talked about before. So it's just funding. Someone will be able to use it, I'm sure, but whether it will be transformational is another question. And then there's this quite big thing, the £1 billion net zero innovation programme, which is quite hard to understand because they keep announcing sub-schemes of this, and you don't know if what is that, another 60 million, or is that part of this billion? But in relation to heat pumps, part of the £1 billion is a fund which is specifically to support the heat pump manufacturers, reducing both the size and the cost of heat pumps. Both of which are interesting and good things to do, but on their own, I doubt very much that they will, create a market for heat pumps or retrofit. So what's missing? This is my, initial list of what I think is missing. There's not enough funding for heat pumps. It's just the first step. There is nothing convincing on skills for retrofit. Compared with what I've just been talking about, they haven't engaged with this really at all. The systems for quality assurance and compliance that they put proposing really, again, that's totally inadequate. There's nothing there to support the existing systems in terms of new finance that I've seen. Nothing on the governance of heat networks. Again, it's exhortation for more heat networks to come. We think this is an interesting technology, but that we should have more of them, but not enough to put in place the system that would make it happen. There is something a bit funny going on about the signal to industry on boilers, because the push is for heat pumps, but then in reserve is hydrogen, and possibly hydrogen boilers or hydrogen hybrid boilers. And so this becomes a little bit unclear to me. And actually, one of the things that we need from this strategy is a clear signal to industry. So I can imagine that one of the responses from the heat pump sector is going to be, either to push for hydrogen boilers instead, or to point out the inconsistencies, or whatever it might be. Yeah, we'll see how that goes. But it does seem to lack the clarity that you would want. And then, I've mentioned this before, I think the lack of ambition on retrofit means that if we could get that quantity of electrification of heat going on, the implications for the electricity grid are vast. How is that actually going to work, and how much will it cost? Really unclear. And then, even though we waited for quite a long time, I understand that this is a big document and there's lots in here, so I'm not really criticising it, but there's several issues which are they're going to be out for consultation in the new year. So it's still kind of watch this space to some extent. And then finally, I think if you take a step back from it, the total sums of money proposed are just too small to tackle it. It's a vast problem we're talking about. So I think there's a sense here that they're trying to kind of dip a toe in water and hope that the industry will just run off and do everything. And that, I'm afraid, is where I come back to my point about market transformation. That's just pie in the sky, really. Okay. Pie in the sky is where I will end on the heat and building strategy. Thank you very much. I look forward to a good discussion. What should I do with this slide?
Can you unshare the bottom?
Unshare it.
And then close down.
How do I unshare it?
The little X.
You need to be on camera now.
Right.
Oh, you're there now. I see.
Have I unshared it yet? Have you unshared it?
Yeah, I think we're fine.
I'm completely new to this hybrid thing. This is the first time I've done a live talk and also been on camera at the same time.
Shall I come around and just...
Yeah,
I'll just
sure.
come for a second.
Where shall I stand?
If you just stand to the one side for a moment. So thank you very much indeed, Gavin, for that. We're going to try and have a conversation involving people in the room and online, which is always interesting. What I was going to first ask is whether Daniel Sharp is available to turn his camera on and ask a question around dividing up space and insulating at the same time, so perhaps addressing the housing need and improving energy efficiency. So Daniel, do you want to turn your camera on for that? Okay, so please go ahead.
I don't. Can you hear me? You can hear me. Right. I'm going to read my question I put in the chat. Can we afford to insulate and heat 50% of space and fabric not meeting genuine housing needs? Should we incentivise subdivisions to make better use of this resource and reduce the need for new build with its construction carbon? And then I put a link to an article I wrote on that, a blog post actually I wrote on that.
Interesting question. Where do I go? I feel like somebody at one of these dances where you're not quite sure what you're supposed to do, but there is a definite place to stand. Thanks, Daniel, for your question. Conversions of properties is one of the things that's taken account of in terms of the potential for doing this kind of work. And I think you're absolutely right. It's a great opportunity to do some of that retrofit work because you're having the disruption and the cost anyway. Could we, I think that, though, the push of your question is the other way around. Could we come up with a policy proposal to increase the amount of conversion and therefore reduce the amount of space taken by each individual person and maybe get away from, the classic tale is the older person who lives at home, lives alone in a 4-bedroom house because their children have left home, and could we find a more efficient way of using that as a resource? Is that sort of where you're coming from?
Exactly. It's a Danny Dorling argument, really. I mean, he's a member of this parish.
Right.
50% of unoccupied space seems to be completely unsustainable, and the rate of new build with its construction carbon equally unsustainable. And we have millions of people on custom build registers and millions of people like me downsizing. Seems to be doable, but we need proof of concept. We need some of your 100 or 1,000 examples to get the custom builders in to subdivide properties.
So I'm going to say that I think we've got an ageing demographic, so this could be an increasing issue. But I don't want the whole debate to be taken over by this particular thing, because I think in relation to the scale of the housing stock, it's still actually relatively small. It's an interesting opportunity, let's say. My take on this is asking an elderly person or whoever it is to move out of their 4-bedroom, 5-bedroom, too big property does partly depend on where they go to. Now, I think you're suggesting that they convert their own property and live in a smaller part of it, and then the other part of it is available for sale. But there's another opportunity, which is to say, if we had a lot of better housing, new housing, that was better suited to the needs of an ageing population, and you've got, for example, there's companies like McCarthy and Stone which provide apartments they're not care homes and they're not residential homes, they're independent living, but there's a kind of warden on site, and if you have a problem in the night, there's somebody that you can buzz. And they have shared resources like shared laundries, so each apartment doesn't have its own washing machine, but you go to the laundry to do your washing. Some of those things, I think, could help unlock some of the potential you're talking about. But it's a little bit like one of those games of tiles where you need to have one of the tile spaces empty in order to move all the other tiles around. So I think we need to have an attractive alternative for those people to move to in order to release the properties. I think the idea that you're going to get people to put up with the disruption and cost of partitioning an existing home whilst they live in it, it might appeal to some, but I don't think it's attractive enough to be a mass solution. But you're absolutely right that you could do the conversion to heat pumps, the insulation, changing the pipes, changing the radiators all at the same time, because that kind of level of project is big and it's going to be disruptive and it's going to be costly. So if we don't do the retrofit at the same time, we're not going to do the retrofit for another 10 years. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your question, Daniel. Can I just move on to a question from the room now, please? It's really a question about the trade-offs between customer acceptance and the most efficient technology. So for example, if a retrofit of a boiler that runs on a new energy source like hydrogen is something that's more straightforward for the market and for consumers to accept, to what extent are we prepared to accommodate the probable higher cost of the energy supply that needs to go into making hydrogen rather than direct energy supply?
No, I absolutely, but well, the thing is, I think you need to strongly support one or the other, or both, if you're going to do both, and have some idea of how much you want to, where the mix is going to be. There are plenty of arguments against hydrogen in dwellings. You know, it's relatively low temperature stuff. The production of hydrogen in itself is relatively inefficient. If you're going to use renewable electricity to split a water molecule in Aberdeen and then transport the hydrogen, you know, why not use the electricity that comes down the wires in the home? But the consumer acceptance thing, I think the point is well made. I guess I go back to the point I made about the installers being very influential over decisions. If we could find a way of reconfiguring the system so that that army of 45,000 firms was knowledgeable and informative and well able to communicate all the options to people, then that would be an important win. But all of it does need support. And I think at the moment the government is fudging between heat pumps, which they'd like to happen, but then kind of keeping hydrogen boilers in reserve just in case the heat pump thing doesn't work. And I understand why they're doing that. But my concern about the hydrogen boiler thing, it looks like a more direct drop-in replacement, and maybe the hybrid ones are, but you pay a different kind of penalty. You're paying a carbon penalty, or you're paying an efficiency of the overall system penalty. And my view is that hydrogen that we're going to need is going to be needed for industrial processes and other uses. And if we use the hydrogen in applications like domestic, oh gosh, the quantity of hydrogen we're going to need, again, it's just massive. So, I mean, there are no easy answers to this stuff.
We have a question from Hugh online. So, Hugh, are you okay to turn your camera on?
Behind you.
Yeah, we're trying to alternate. So, if Hugh,
I'll stop trying to change.
That's all right. Thank you.
Am I unmuted?
We can hear you fine, Hugh.
I think I've turned the camera on too. From all that you've said, it seems firstly that there's very little coordinated, joined-up thinking in the government yet. Thank you very much for producing a report that may help them to do some joined-up thinking. But I've had several friends recently say, my boiler's clapped out, what should I do? And there is no incentive for people to do anything other than replace their boiler with another old-fashioned natural gas boiler. Don't we need some sort of experiment, which is what you were sort of implying, that gives the first lot of people enough money to install a heat pump, because they're not going to get a hydrogen supply. There may be a possibility of a boiler that can both burn natural gas and hydrogen, but to install a heat pump, so that we get some experience. And yes, that's going to cost money, but surely it needs to get started.
Yes, yes, I think that's all true. When I was when the heat and building strategy was first announced, there was a little flurry of activity in the media, and The Guardian had written an article. Okay, it's The Guardian, but The Guardian had written an article, and they had found 4 people who had had heat pumps installed, and of the 4, 2 had had a really positive experience, said it was wonderful, fantastic technology, best thing they've ever done. One person thought it was okay, but could see a few issues with it, and one person said it's a complete waste of time and money because in the depths of winter it doesn't give me enough heat. So just when I need heating most, I don't have a heating system that works, and so it's a complete white elephant. Now, that's only 4 anecdotes, if you like, but we need to get heat pumps to a point, the installation of heat pumps to a point where that kind of tail doesn't happen, or if it happens only a tiny amount. And the issue with heat pumps is it's not a direct drop-in technology for your boiler. So there's been a whole load of debate recently about, you should have insulated your home to have a heat pump, or you have to replace the radiators, or The pipes that are a narrow bore for a gas-fired boiler won't work with a heat pump because it operates at lower temperatures. The thing is, in some cases, all of those things will be true. And in other cases, some of them won't be true. So I go back to the installer, the person who's called into the home to do the assessment, doing the audit. That's the person you need to equip with the knowledge and skills to be able to do it, because they're the ones who are going to advise the customer about what the solution is. And it's not possible to say, in every case, you have to replace radiators. It's just not true. There's too much diversity in the building stock. So what I'm talking about is a very highly devolved system of design, specification, technical understanding, and consumer care, which is a long way from what we have. And I think every time you have a technology discussion in this space, you very quickly get into yeah, but who's going to do it, and how's it going to work, and is it going to be good enough discussion. So that's sort of my answer. If somebody said to me, oh, my boiler's just clapped out. In fact, a friend said this to me the other day. My boiler's clapped out. What should I do? My honest advice to a friend is get another boiler. Not because it's a good idea for the climate, but because it's a really bad idea for all other reasons. Unless you happen to be in a situation where you've got a lot of building work going on anyway, you know you're going to have to invest in a new heating system, and you can find a really competent firm to help you with doing all of that stuff. If you can get all of those elements of the jigsaw in place, great, go ahead. But we're not talking about a boiler that's packed up in a home that's basically functional. There we're talking about a major renovation project. So.
But if we're not going to be allowed a new gas boiler by 2035, we've got to have more experience of what we need to do.
Yeah, absolutely, for sure.
If you don't mind, I'm going to move on to the next question in the room, just to keep the conversation flowing. And I think Chris Church has a question. Chris, you should be on camera, except you're looking very blurred. So let me try and blur the background. Oh, dear. It's
you can come and stand here.
Okay, sorry. Well, it's okay. Let me just try one more time. Bear with me. I'm trying to turn off my background effects. Look at that. Okay. Chris, there you are. You have a halo around you.
Yeah.
So please speak up for the microphone.
Right, I can see me in the background. Yeah, markets rely on two things. You've talked an awful lot about how we can transform the supply. What I remain worried about is the demand. There's a huge difference between homeowners and customers. And I'm interested that during one of the phenomena from lockdown and around it has been all these builders with 6-month waiting lists because people have wanted to renovate their homes, but they don't seem to want to retrofit. And talking to people about retrofit, I hear a lot of stuff about language and communication, about how retrofit sounds, well, dirty, messy, confusing, and there's all these stories about people's heat pumps that don't work. Should we not be trying to really focus on something a bit more positive, like eco-renovation, really trying to plug into all the interest there is in all these homes magazines about doing up your homes, and really thinking, but I mean, so there's that part of it, and the other part is the leaky teapot. I mean, I'm with Caroline Lucas. I'm not sure why we're trying to heat our buildings when they are still leaking so badly. In 1982, I can remember the Manpower Services Commission, you know, people going around insulating lofts, and people still don't want their lofts insulated because it's a hassle. It seems to me there's a lot more we have to really think here. We need to do everything you've said, but there needs to be a lot to really think, how do we actually make this something that people feel is something that is accessible, affordable, interesting, and fun even, you know?
Yeah, no, I think that's right, and I think there is a message, a job of communication to do. I've used the term retrofit because it's used in a particular way, and sometimes other terms like eco-renovation can mean something else. Their focus is on paint made of chalk or something. You know, so you have to be a little bit careful. Or you know, eco-renovation is about covering everything in timber, which I've got no objection to. I think, in answer to your question, I'm going to draw a comparison between what we're doing on climate and what we did with the pandemic. Because actually, with the pandemic, we pulled together, we had broadly consistent messaging from the centre. Everyone was watching the media all the time and paying attention to stuff. And there was a sense that we had to pull together in order to achieve something that was the common good. And in a sense, what I do sort of doesn't matter. It's what we as a collective do. With climate change, we don't have any of that. We talk about individual consumer choice, and then we talk about global CO2 reduction targets, but there's no sense of we should pull together. And actually, I'm going to slightly dodge the where's the demand question, because I think the demand and supply need to be stimulated at the same time. The finance packages, for example, is about stimulating demand as well as supply. But if you talk to builders and installers in the industry, as I've done, they're conscious of all this stuff, actually probably more than most property owners. And they're the one, it's the plumbers who are saying, the heating engineers, we're still fitting gas boilers, why are we doing this? But they're complicit in a system which installs gas boilers. They on their own can't change that system. They're an important part of it, but they're just one part.
One comeback, which is the public sector decarbonisation. You were saying that's not enough, but it does seem like that is going to kick some of these builders and plumbers and people into action. Should we not be really kind of trying to work with the housing associations so that people think, actually, my housing association retrofitted house is the envy of all my neighbours?
Yes and no. Yes, I think there's some element of the power of demonstration, but no, because actually when you look at the way the construction industry is structured, people stay in subsectors most of the time. So the public sector decarbonisation fund is actually for commercial building, and the crossover between people who work in commercial building and residential is relatively small. It's not zero, it's relatively small. The difference between the firms that work on existing homes and the volume house builders is quite big. So I think it helps to think of it as subsectors, and then each subsector makes sort of coherent sense. If we set up a series of demonstrators in the social housing world, that might help influence other social housing providers. But the idea that the installers who've worked for a housing association are then going to go off and tell their next private customer that this is the way to go, I think is actually misplaced, because what happens is the customers doesn't know any of this stuff. I mean, social landlords are actually professional clients. They do repeat work, and by and large, they're pretty good. They don't have funding, and there's some variety. But the private sector, people have no idea. So if somebody comes along and says, I did this interesting thing in a housing association down the road, do you want one? Well, even if the customer says yes, very quickly it's a question of, well, how much does it cost and where can I get it from? And then the answer is, well, it's an extra £5,000 and you have to wait 12 weeks for it. And then the consumer choice is, well, actually, is there anything quicker? You go, yeah, I have a boiler. I've got boilers on my van now, I can do it for you today. That's how the industry operates. So you have to create this system to make it all work, unfortunately.
Just to mention, Anya Beardworth last week talked about sufficiency, so please have a look online for a recording of that, because that's quite interesting relating to what Daniel was talking about, the size of houses and so forth. I'm going to take the next question in the room and then come to another questionnaire. Let's try the camera trick again. Right, if I move out of the way.
You have to move into the halo.
So, maybe, would you mind standing up to see if that helps?
I'm George Blomberg. I work at Oxford Brooks, and I wanted to thank you for a nice talk. Actually, very thought-provoking. And what I was thinking about while you were talking is how will all this work contribute to us achieving our obligations under the Paris Agreement? And if all this work is really going to get us anywhere? And I think maybe I share a little bit of your frustration. I picked up a few of the things that you said about the government's response, and there was a comment about government linked up thinking and things like that. And it does occur to me that a few things. One is that the students in sort of the construction management programs are all learning about carbon budgeting and carbon accounting. I mean, that's the big thing. And we're teaching our students how to set up systems within large construction companies on how to do full life cycle costing on every project. And the reason we're doing that is we think that that's almost inevitable that it'll become obligatory for larger projects. Just because it's the only way we see as these carbon reductions actually being achieved, and actually it looks exhausting from the other end of the spectrum. This really is a two-tier system we're working on, and the comments about these small shops and informal working, tax-free, they're completely unfamiliar to the sort of students that are graduating from our university. And certainly this two-tier system is something worth considering. It's certainly, and in thinking about it, I'm just thinking about how sort of easy it is to work through large projects, require full carbon costing, require a systematic reduction in the carbon footprint through the life cycle of the building, and also as the company evolves and as technology improves. And the other thing is to assume that we will have some sort of global carbon market in offsets and so forth. And it's not working yet because we don't have proper carbon capture, but eventually we will. We hope we will, otherwise none of this will work. And that we think that our students are going to be the ones who are managing paying for carbon offsets when they do their construction projects. In other words, they'll be buying tonnage of carbon as they work through their design, as they work through the design of their projects. I have one final comment, and I think putting it back to you, and that is, wouldn't it make more sense to change the way we actually live in this country? I mean, so much of the housing that you're talking about is just really inadequate. And I'm looking and living in Oxford, and we live in a city that was badly built for a pretty much dying car industry. You know, it was badly built at the time, and it's been perpetuated, and it's just so inadequate. And yet the planning system and everything is set up to just perpetuate really a bunch of buildings that shouldn't be around anymore. And that what really we should be doing is clearances and rebuilding with the different principles of density and with the different urban setup. And I don't think we're going to achieve anything. I don't think we're going to achieve much in terms of carbon reduction unless we reconfigure about what we really want out of our housing and our sort of our building stuff.
Okay, thank you very much. I was going to just give you a pause to concentrate all
sorry,
that.
I've thrown an awful lot at you, but I thought your talk was really interesting, and it provoked all these thoughts.
Thank you. So can I respond?
Yes, I was just going to say, if you wind back, I don't know, 10 years ago, Brenda Boardman was probably saying, well, maybe we should demolish all of this Victorian housing stock, but you do have heritage and history to think about.
It was 16 years ago, and I was involved in that report, and it's a red herring. It's my honest opinion. Sorry, Brenda, if you're on the line. Three points, I think, in response to what you said, and I thought your comments were all very, very interesting. How many of the students at Brookes University get involved in renovation of dwellings? I think probably quite a small number. And what I'm talking about is operations at a scale often smaller than those that require a designer, an architect, or an engineer. So what you're saying about that, I think I go back to my point about subsectors of the construction industry. The people who learn training in construction management and architecture at Brookes are going to work for bigger firms. They're not going to be the small firms involved in this retrofit. Okay. Carbon accounting, I think, is really interesting. But goodness me, if we could get the retrofit thing sorted out, you know, we'd be going a long way towards it. I think the whole life carbon issue is really interesting, and it becomes more relevant if you can reduce your operational energy consumption. But we haven't yet reduced our operational energy consumption, and it's still, by a long way, the biggest element. So I'm not against it in principle. I think it's a good idea. If I try to apply it to a building site, I think I would probably put quite a lot of the responsibility for that whole life carbon stuff on product manufacturers, not on the builders. Once the thing has arrived on site, they're going to use it. Or once it's in the merchants, they're going to buy it and use it. The bit of the system that I would place the burden on the builders is on waste management. So they're not buying in insulation that's taken tons of energy to produce and then breaking it before it even gets installed and throwing it straight in the skip. And that stuff happens. It's better than it was, but that stuff still happens. There was one other point that you made, which was about a carbon market and offsetting. I think there's no way that we're going to have a carbon price that's ever going to work. And in any case, how would you administer that system? Whether we need carbon capture and storage and try and encompass everything into one big system so that somehow the decision whether to run carbon capture or to renovate this building over here in Oxford, I think is just, no, I just don't think it's going to work. Let's focus on what this industry can do and get them to do it. And then finally, I think I take exception to the characterisation of Oxford. There is a kind of sweet spot of building density, and I think Oxford has it, actually. So there are issues around Oxford which are difficult. The quality of the building stock and thermal performance is poor. You can argue about the quality of the cycle routes and things, but in terms of access to amenity, it's pretty good. And you compare it with cities in North America or Australia, where they're doing densification as a retrofit process in cities. We are pretty livable, actually, as a city. Yes, there are some issues, and it's not perfect, but I think in terms of densification, it's about right. It's pretty optimal.
Well, it's about right if you're living here and you're lucky enough to have a house. But in turn, I think I was thinking about achieving these carbon reduction. What's the best or most efficient way to do it? And it just seems like torture the way it seems you picked the most difficult sector, the difficult part of our built environment, and trying to work out all these different, it's a bit like juggling. It just seems, it's demoralizing. I feel slightly depressed by it.
Oh, I feel, there is plenty of evidence for feeling utterly despondent and depressed by it. Yeah, there are the trade-offs, and there are none. We have to do everything. We can't say we can't do the built environment because we're going to do more on transport. If you go to a transport seminar, they'll argue that we should do less on transport and do more on the built environment because buildings are easy. For a long time in this country, and not just this country, the assumption has been that because the technology exists, that it will somehow happen. I've not seen a plausible scenario for decarbonisation that doesn't include renovating existing buildings.
I'm going to use Chairman's prerogative to say, let's not get too depressed with all of this and squeeze in one more question from the room, please, if you would.
I'm Flora, I'm a PhD student in the Energy and Power Group. So actually the comment on the carbon market might have provided an answer to my question, but if you don't think that works, then I'll be interested in your answer. So you're saying there's not enough funding for retrofits, but it seems like there's a conflict of interests between the people that need to invest in retrofits and the loss of revenue that retrofits would cause them. So the electricity providers, the network operators, they do need to sell energy to have revenues. Whereas when you invest in retrofitting, you're actually paying money to get less revenues. You're paying money to sell less energy. And that's the same problems with the landlords that don't have incentives to invest in retrofits if they're not the one paying the bills. So you said, I thought the comment was interesting, that the low ambition in retrofits mean that we'll need to invest more money in renewable energy. But that's the sort of investment where you do actually get returns, because people then buy energy and then pay for your technology, right? So I'm not saying I think we should do retrofits, right? There's benefits to society, avoiding climate-related costs, cutting bills. But if we want it to work at the government budget level, how do we align these incentives so that it works?
Really good question. I don't have a complete answer to that question. A lot more than we're thinking. You can take it to the level of things like Nicholas Stern and people saying that tackling climate change will cost, whatever it is, 3% of global GDP, but not tackling climate change will cost a lot more. That high level kind of macroeconomic modelling is not my field. I think, if I understand the question right, the point about electricity is we're talking about reconfiguring the networks, the grids, and coping with a lot of decentralised generation, but also electrifying a lot of demand, both through buildings and transport. There just isn't capacity. So at the moment, you look at, we've already got pinch points in the electricity network where things are not, the suppliers are saying, if you want that connection, it's going to cost eye-watering amounts of money because we don't have the capacity to cope with it all. Whether that's, people installing electric vehicle charging or possibly loads of heat pumps. I think I view these things as two separate things. The energy efficiency side of it, there was a quote that I like, which is that we've traditionally treated energy efficiency as an energy industry problem and got the funding for it through obligations on energy providers. It's not an energy industry problem. It's a construction industry problem. And that's, if you like, that's what the focus of my talk was and the focus of the report. What we do to reinforce the networks and get enough electricity, enough renewable electricity on the system and get enough flexibility so that we can manage the different demands whilst we're also electrifying heat and transport, that is an electricity system problem. I think both of those things will require significant amounts of investment, and we need both of them. And they need to join up. But I think it's wrong to say that we have to rely on the electricity supply system to pay for retrofits. What we're looking for the electricity supply system to do is provide enough electricity to run the heat pumps in the efficient homes that have been renovated by the construction industry. Sorry, that's a bit of a long-winded. Does it make sense?
It does make sense, yes. I mean, I agree on
Good question.
I think we agree on the end point, right? That's the ideal outcome. But it's just how do we get the government to make those investments, even though there's no direct returns on those investments, right? But you also provided.
I mean, the construction industry that I characterise, the small businesses who work in renovation, the government doesn't like engaging with that kind of industry. They like working with bigger business where there's a small number of stakeholders that they can understand and control easily, and that they sort of somehow share some culture. But I think in the eyes of government, retrofit, there's several things going on. One, it's easy, and so therefore why need to bother? Because the technology exists, but in brackets, doesn't mean it happens. It's boring. It's fundamentally not very sexy, energy efficiency. So that's another reason to put it to one side. And then you've got this kind of Wild West frontier of completely unregulated people driving around in vans bashing buildings for a living. How on earth do you get them to come on board and help you solve climate change? Oh, and improve the health and well-being and all the other benefits. So I think they see it as simultaneously too dull, too sort of, well, so what, it should have happened by now already, and at the same time too risky, sort of politically risky to engage with. And as I showed in my slide, the history of the past policies is that they've just not done it right. They've assumed it's too easy in the policies that have been adopted previously.
I think you could argue they overcomplicated it in some ways as well. But
the thing that they failed to understand was how the market operates, and they also assumed that consumers are rational economic decision makers and that the only thing that was needed was a financial incentive. And that, I think, is wrong. And there's plenty of, as I showed in my talk, there's plenty of history of other success stories where you don't just do the financial incentive, you have to bring the other pieces in, and then it can begin to work.
okay, I said we'll find time for one last question from the room. Yes.
Okay, oh sorry, I thought I only had time. I have to qualify my comment / question immediately with the fact I am an architect, so this is why I'm asking this question.
You're very welcome.
There does seem to be in your talk quite a lot of conversation about putting up the onus on builders to be coming up with the schemes and understanding and doing all the coordination. And I'm a director of a local practice, and it's full of architects, all who trained at Oxford Brookes, and all who are really keen on retrofit. And we get, admittedly, Oxford is an unusual city, but we get a lot of inquiries, and we're feeling the gap in our knowledge, actually, of how do we go about retrofitting this properly. And I found that you presented the retrofitting coordinated course that there is, and I think we're looking at doing that now. And I wonder whether, so I understand, I think, why you're focusing so much on builders, because a lot of projects don't involve architects at the moment. But maybe they could, and maybe they should, because actually this complex coordination that you're talking about is is what we do. And there is a local practice in Oxford called Transition by Design, and I know they're a cooperative, and one of the guys there is. Are you familiar with them? Yeah, because exactly, Andy, and it's Alex who is working for Cambridge Council at the moment, rolling out how they can retrofit 50,000 homes, and there are architects doing that. So I think that there's some bridging the gap here, where it's the type of, and actually sort of in response to what your question is, kind of, because I used to run a master's program at Oxford Brookes as well, and not a program, a design studio, sorry. And I remember testing with the students, you were like, well, actually, if we could generate enough energy so we didn't have issues with peak demand, why do we need to retrofit? Because we just got endless supplies of energy. It's quite helpful to play with these ideas sometimes. But that doesn't necessarily equate to the building comfort that you're talking about as well. And then also, this creates huge numbers of jobs. You're right, there's issues about it being a bit unsexy, but then the comment that Chris kind of came up with earlier about giving it a better name. Sometimes when things have a name, people kind of attach themselves to it a bit differently. So I'm not really asking you a question, but it was just interesting to me listening to the talk, and not until I think your question was asked, did you mention construction professionals other than builders? And I'm just wondering whether it could be a bit more part of the conversation, but I know also appreciate you do huge amounts of research, and it was half an hour that you were talking for.
No, it's a really interesting question. I will mention there's a special issue of Journal for Buildings and Cities, which talks about education for mainstreaming zero carbon. And I had a paper in that, and it was co-fronted by a Professor of Architecture at Sheffield University, who used to be at Brookes, Fiona Stevenson.
Oh, she was my tutor.
Right. There's this debate going on within architecture and mechanical and building services engineering, as well as the construction labourers, the kind of craft trades. I focused on the craft trades here, partly because that's my research focus, and partly because our client was the Federation of Master Builders, and that's who they are. There's actually an argument. I mean, I guess my answer to this question is yes, and all of these things are needed. There are really good examples of builders who really get this stuff and are frustrated that there's not a bigger market for it. There are really good examples of architectural practice the same, and engineers the same. But it's also true that there are really bad examples in all three of those professions, and the industry can get caught up in a blame game. The architect blames the builders because they just didn't understand the drawings and they just did it really badly. The engineer blames the architect for doing something which is aesthetically pleasing but impossible to heat in any efficient way. And the builders blame both the engineers and the architects for not having a practical bone in their bodies and expecting them to fit a duct which is this big in a gap which is this big. So I think again, it's an integration solution. What we actually need is much better shared learning between the builders, but also the professions. There's the phrase that I keep playing with is intermediate skills. We have a kind of low-skill construction sector, and then a sort of graduate level professional designers. But the piece in the middle, where the retrofit coordinator lives, and where the sort of level 3, level 4 NVQ type things are, they're not high-tech manufacturing jobs I'm talking about, but they are decent, well-paid jobs, doing a good job, helping maintain the built environment. And actually, you could argue that they're at the intersection of the buildings, the labourers, builders on the ground, and the design professionals. Because actually, you need to have an understanding of design. One of the reasons the heat pumps get installed badly is because people don't understand how the heat pump works in the building and what the flow temperatures are and all the rest of it. So all of that stuff is important. You could argue that everybody needs to know it. Whether you can regulate to have an architect as a requirement on a job is an interesting one. There are countries that have that. Over a certain size of project in terms of spend, you're obligated to have an architect. Personally, I think in this country there are other ways of doing it, but maybe that's the thing. But better shared understanding is certainly key, and I think there's a role for educating the architects, which some is beginning to happen. But there's also a big piece of work to do in the further education trade sector as well.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Gavin, for entertaining a discussion. So if we didn't get to everyone's questions, but thanks very much indeed again from everyone.
No, thanks for the really interesting questions.
This is chance for a quick advert while my face is up on the big screen there.
Yeah, go on then.
Firstly, just a reminder to sign up to the energy newsletter, and we stay in the built environment. Next week we'll have Ben Musso, Chief Technical and Partnership Officer Lead from Urbanomi. I knew I wouldn't say it correctly, but he's looking at particularly at the Saltcross Garden Village development and the energy plan associated with that has been undertaken on behalf of Oxfordshire County Council. So that'll be 4 o'clock, again in person or online next week. Thank you all very much for joining us, and have a good evening.
Thank you. Thanks.